Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. The book of Habakkuk is what you might call one of the flyover books in the Old Testament. This book is classified as one of the minor prophets, one of those small, short books at the end of the Old Testament that's easy to skip over. But the minor prophets are only minor because the books are short. They still have important messages for us today, as we'll see. The minor prophets, like Habakkuk, still contain passages of Scripture that are familiar to us, and by exploring these books and their contexts, we can see how God speaks to us and is at work in a wide range of circumstances. In today's video, we're going to look at chapter 3 of the book of Habakkuk. The setting and style of the book of Habakkuk can make it hard to understand what's going on without some help. Just briefly, the book of Habakkuk is named after a prophet named Habakkuk, from chapter 1, verse 1, who is its presumed author. The setting is generally understood to be sometime in the late 7th century BC, when the Assyrian Empire is falling apart and the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire is on the rise. Habakkuk sees injustice and wickedness prospering all around him and complains to God about this. He receives a response from God that God will send the Chaldeans to punish those who act unjustly. Now, we would expect a biblical prophet to be happy about this news, but Habakkuk responds with shock because the Chaldeans are no better than the Assyrians, and their wickedness is prospering too. God responds with an assurance that he also will judge the Chaldeans in due time. This exchange between God and Habakkuk leads to Habakkuk 3, which is a psalm extolling God's power. I want to encourage you to pause here and go read Habakkuk 3. It's an amazing hymn with a lot of ancient Near Eastern elements that we're going to explore. Regarding the text itself, it's interesting to note that the language is what is called archaic. That means the style and the words are old, probably older than the rest of the book of Habakkuk. This could be because Habakkuk chose to write in an older style, or more likely because Habakkuk took an existing older hymn and adapted it for his own purposes. Secondly, this is what can be called a theophonic hymn. This means this text describes God presenting or revealing God's self, a theophany. In this case, God is portrayed as a divine warrior riding into battle in a thunderstorm. Later, the psalm transitions from this theophonic hymn to one of prayer, asking for help from the revealed divine warrior.
For our purposes, today we'll divide this passage into two sections. First, we'll look at verses 2 through 15, and then we'll look at verses 16 to 19. The first section is what we've called a theophonic hymn. This is a description of God revealing himself through a storm and battle against the watery forces of chaos. This section draws on motifs and themes from other Near Eastern cultures in which a storm god defeats a chaos monster and its watery allies. In this motif, a god, often a storm god, defeats the forces of chaos and establishes order in the cosmos. This idea is in the background of this first section, but we don't have time to really dive into it into great depth. We will look at this theme in greater detail in future videos. For now, we will highlight only a few elements that we see in this passage. For starters, this section names several geographic locations. Teman is used in the Hebrew Bible as another name for Edom, or at least a region in Edom, in an area south of Judah. Similarly, Mount Paran is likely referring to Mount Sinai. And later in this section, Cushan and Midian are referenced together. And while scholars aren't exactly sure where Cushan is, Midian is an area even further south than Edom in northern Arabia. And some think Cushan may be the name of an Arab tribe or a clan of Midian. From all of these location references, we can understand that Yahweh is coming out of the south. Similarly, we see this in Deuteronomy 33 and an extremely old passage in Judges 5 called the Song of Deborah. Over the course of this psalm, Yahweh is portrayed as coming out of the south with lightning and other terrible and awesome powers on display. All of creation is trembling before him. And when we look a bit closer, the language can help us imagine what the author is describing. For example, in verse 4, the phrase rays flashed is literally two horns, which calls to mind this image. This was a common symbol of the storm god in Syria and Mesopotamia, the storm god named either Adad or Baal Hadad. It was a symbol of the god and his weapon of lightning. And this is what we see with the deity. This is what we see here with the deity, recognized as such by their horned helmet, holding the symbol of lightning, and they're actually riding a hybrid creature of a lion dragon. Notably in this passage, God is not alone. Modern translations will often render verses 5 as plague went before him, pestilence followed his steps. While this is accurate, it actually obscures an essential element of this verse. Plague and pestilence are best understood as semi-divine beings. They are angelic figures in God's retinue. In fact, the word that's translated plague here is Resheph, which we know as the name of a deity in the Canaanite pantheon. This god was known at the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit as one who helped the storm god Baal defeat the water god Yam and Yam's helpers. In fact, one line in the Baal cycle from Ugarit states that in this battle with Yam, the archer Resheph shot his kidneys in his heart. Back in Habakkuk, verse 6 highlights the antiquity of the mountains and the hills and helps us place this account as an event that happened at the beginning of time. A long time ago, God came forward in his wrath in the storm and laid low the forces of chaos and disorder. Those forces are named in verse 8 as the rivers and sea. This recalls the Ugaritic story where the storm god fights the sea god Yam, who is also called Judge River. The word for rivers here is not in its usual form. By that I mean, if you were to write the word rivers in Hebrew, you would usually write it like this. But that is not how it's written here. It has a different ending, not the typical plural ending. This may be because this passage is poetry and sometimes spelling and grammar rules get bent in poetry in order to fit the form. This grammatical difference, however, has led some scholars to suggest this word was originally in what's called dual form. Now in English, our nouns can be singular or plural to indicate one or more than one thing. But in other languages, including Hebrew, they have a dual form that indicates two of something. If the word rivers here was originally in dual, this may indicate that God's wrath was portrayed as being directed against the two rivers. This is significant because in Ugaritic literature, the god El is said to live at the source of the twin rivers, by the pool of the double deep. And this seal from Mari shows the god El on his mountain with the sources of the twin river flowing from it. In this same seal, we see what is probably the storm god attacking the river with his lance, which reinforces the twin rivers as the chaotic foe of the storm god. And we see a reference to a lance in Habakkuk 3, verse 11. Habakkuk also describes God riding in a chariot or on a horse shooting his bow. We see this image on several seals of a storm god attacking chaotic figures with a bow. We've discussed these seals and others in another video about a theophanic psalm, Psalm 29, which you can see here. In that video, we also discussed why the biblical writers would borrow the imagery of other ancient Near Eastern gods to describe Yahweh, and that discussion applies to Habakkuk 3 as well. In these drawings of seals from Syria, we see a god in a chariot with two attendants behind. Again, we see a striking parallel here in Habakkuk 3 with God in his chariot with plague and pestilence, or Resheph and Deber, going with him. This seal drawing shows a god on his chariot being drawn not by horses but by a lion dragon, the same hybrid creature we saw earlier being ridden by a Mesopotamian storm god. To summarize, this first part of the hymn describes Yahweh coming out of the south in time immemorial in a terrible storm, wielding awesome weapons against the chaotic forces of the universe. Verses 12 and 13 pivot and indicate that this awesome power is being deployed not only against the chaotic forces, but also against the enemies of Israel. Remember how this passage fits with the rest of Habakkuk, which began with the prophet seeing Israel's enemies prospering at Israel's expense. Now, the primordial powers of Yahweh is being summoned to judge and defeat the enemies about whom Habakkuk complained. Now we'll pivot to the discussion of the psalm in Habakkuk 3.
Verses 16 to 19 switch to a first-person perspective. Now, this may demarcate where the older, more archaic part of the poem ends and the later edition begins. Now, this is perhaps Habakkuk's contribution to an older hymn. Verse 16 seems to move from the description of the warrior god arriving on the storm to Habakkuk's experience of this awesome sight. But a closer look at the language shows us that this is not the case. The word translated here as trembling is usually used to refer to the panic of trembling before oncoming enemies, or of impending judgment, or a sense of grief or shame. We don't find this word used elsewhere to express a response to a theophany. Elsewhere, rottenness to the bone also refers to shame. So we see that Habakkuk is not responding to this theophany with awe, but with shame. Why does he respond with shame to the sight of such a magnificent display of God's power? Well, Habakkuk knows God's power and might, God's wrath and righteous anger, God's ability to bring order out of chaos. Now, God is supposed to be so great and do great things, but where is the evidence of that greatness in Habakkuk's present circumstances? Why has God not acted against Assyria and Babylon as he did in ancient days against the forces of chaos at the time of creation? Why is it that God's judgment simply to let one unrighteous empire replace another, rather than to set things right and restore his people Israel? Habakkuk says that he is reduced to shame because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. What Habakkuk sees in his day is a lack of order. There is no shalom in the land. There is no visible manifestation of divine order being administered. Shalom was usually seen as agricultural and social abundance and cohesion. It was when life was rightly ordered. Now, while this passage doesn't use the word shalom, verse 17 in particular describes a lack of shalom. It says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls. Yet, despite these grim circumstances, and despite knowing the fate that awaits Israel as the Chaldeans advance into their land, Habakkuk refuses to give in to shame and despair. In the end, he still affirms his faithfulness and confidence in God despite not seeing God's mighty signs and wonders from ages before. In the end, this is the conclusion Habakkuk reaches. He says, "Yet I will exult in the Lord, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength, and he has made my feet like the feet of a deer, and makes me walk on my high places." In fact, Habakkuk begins this chapter by calling on God to remember God's people and demonstrate again the power that ordered the chaotic cosmos. Here's how he makes that appeal. "Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." Now, how can Habakkuk have confidence that his trust in God is not misplaced and that God is able to bring order and justice out of his present circumstances? It's by recounting God's victories from of old. Then Habakkuk can have confidence in God's future victory and justice, even if he doesn't see it. This shift from the past to the future places the Psalm of Habakkuk 3 into the realm of what is called apocalyptic. When we hear the word apocalyptic, we usually think about a disastrous end-of-the-world scenario, but that's not exactly the way apocalyptic literature works in the Bible. The word apocalyptic means that which is revealed, so it naturally fits with this psalm as a theophany, a self-revelation of God. In revealing God's ordering power and victorious might in creation, God is also revealing to Habakkuk that God is able to bring order out of chaos and victory out of defeat in the future. But in apocalyptic, this future order and victory does not simply follow the order of events in this world. It requires the end of this world and the beginning of a new one. The old world of chaos and injustice must, in a sense, come to an end so that a new world in which God's divine order, justice, and shalom are possible, so that that world may be birthed. And when we understand that Habakkuk 3 is an apocalyptic vision, it brings the imagery of this passage full circle. The God who created order out of chaos, who is powerful enough to defeat the forces of darkness, and who judges the unjust, is still able to do those things. Habakkuk's desire for the judgment of Israel's enemies may not come immediately, but it will surely come when God ushers in the new world of shalom and perfect peace. So what does all of this mean for us? Well, it means that in the face of injustice, we can recall who God is from eternity, God's eternal qualities, and God's promise to make all things new. We can remember the ways we have seen God act mightily before, and we can have confidence in God's power to enact justice and judge the wicked, even if they seem to be prospering now. We can trust that God will have the last word and that in the end, everything wrong in this world will be made right in the world to come. This is the overarching message of Habakkuk 3, and it's summarized in Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous person will live by his faithfulness. That was true for Habakkuk, and it's still true for us today. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.